Recording now. Good to go.
Shalom, shalom, friends. A delight to have you with us here in Zoom and here on the live stream, wherever you are in the world. What a great day to learn together the Torah of trauma, something that is our reality as human beings, historically, and most certainly today as well. And we are here with a dear friend and colleague, Rabbi Zachary Truboff, who is the Director of Rabbinic Education for the International Beit Din. He recently made Aliyah and lives with his family in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem. For nearly a decade, he served as the rabbi of Cedar Sinai Synagogue in Cleveland, Ohio. In addition to his work at the shul, he has taught in a variety of adult education settings, including the Torah at Zion Kollel, the Alvin and Laura Siegel College of Jewish Studies, and the Wexner Heritage Program. He served as Director of Jewish Life and Culture at the Mendel JCC, where he founded the Cleveland Jewish Arts and Culture Lab, and was chosen by the Cleveland Jewish News as one of 18 difference makers, a select group honored for their contributions to Jewish communal life in Northeast Ohio. His writing on contemporary Jewish thought and Zionism have appeared in Lehrhaus, Akdamot, E-Jewish Philanthropy, and the Times of Israel. His book, Torah Goes Forth from Zion, Essays on the Thought of Rav Kook and Rav Shigar, will be published this coming year. I am very excited about that. And I'm excited to be with you all here today. Rabbi Truboff has a rare talent of bringing deep textual analysis, deep Jewish wisdom, the personal side of his Torah, and empathy and compassion. So with that, Rav Zach, thanks so much for being here to lead us in the Torah of trauma.
Thank you, Rav Shmuley, and it's an honor to be teaching here, and it's an honor to be given the opportunity to speak about a topic that's not an easy one, but I think it's one that's on a lot of our minds right now. So I came to this mostly from my experience the last 2 years, like all of us, living with the reality of coronavirus. And I'll speak honestly, there have been times where it has not been easy for me. It's been very painful and difficult at times the last 2 years. I've watched as many people I love have suffered greatly under extraordinarily difficult circumstances, including my own children. Coronavirus isn't over, and none of us know if and when it will be over. And I think it's really only now, after the last 2 years, that many are starting to realize that the experience we've all undergone really can only be described as traumatic. And what makes it so hard is that the trauma isn't yet over, and we're still coming to grips with what it means and what are the effects that it has on us. You may have seen there have been many studies over the last several months about the impact of corona on people's mental health. And when I'm speaking about corona, I mean just the whole situation that we've been under. It's bigger than coronavirus itself, and it touches every aspect of our society, as we know. But one of the major things that's been noted is the impact on children, especially the mental health of children, which is in some ways the hardest because they're the most vulnerable. I was actually speaking with a friend just this week who shared with me that their child has been diagnosed with depression and hospitalized for an eating disorder during the pandemic over the past year. It was very clear to my friend just how much the overturned reality had made things worse for their child. And I'll speak even openly in my own family. One of my children was also diagnosed with depression this past year. Thank God it was a light depression, and he's now doing much, much better. But it was very scary to see him go through it. I even saw, I think just yesterday, a prominent rabbi on Facebook post that he has seen an explosion of mental health issues in his shul and his community just in the last, it sounded like, weeks. He hasn't seen anything like this in the almost 3 decades that he's been in the rabbinettes, which I think says something. Trauma affects people in many very intense ways. It can bring about, as I said, feelings of depression, numbness, sadness. It can cause emotional outbursts. It can bring about intense feelings of anger, of shame. It can cause people to self-harm, right? There's many, many different dimensions to the way that the trauma impacts us. Now, obviously, these kinds of issues must be addressed on a variety of levels and from a variety of different perspectives, whether it's schools or mental health professionals, doctors. But what I want to focus on today is how trauma is not just a mental health problem, but also a religious and even a theological problem. And what I want to do over the next hour or so is look at how Judaism and the Torah perceive what our response to trauma should be. How do we understand it? How do we respond to it? But before we can even get into those weighty religious questions, we have to first understand what exactly is trauma, because it's a word that gets used quite a lot, and we don't all know what it means. We don't all even necessarily use it the same way. And try to understand what is it that makes trauma such an intense and difficult problem for us as human beings. So to kind of wrap our arms around what is trauma, what makes something traumatic, we're actually going to spend a little bit of time looking at an important text by Sigmund Freud, father of psychoanalysis, a text called Beyond the Pleasure Principle. We'll also look at another text by Freud. Psychoanalysis in general has a lot of profound insight about trauma. Again, its causes, its effects, how we approach it, how we think about it. And in fact, many of the insights that Freud develops about trauma are ones that have been confirmed by contemporary theorizing of trauma. So I think it's worthwhile to explore what he has to say. I'll also say that, the kinds of trauma that we are talking about with regards to coronavirus, or even just the way that trauma gets used today in a lot of different contexts, it's all actually somewhat new. I don't know if any of you know what trauma actually means, but it comes from the Greek meaning wound. It's the reason why hospitals have trauma wards. Those are the places that people go when they've had a serious bodily injury and they need medical treatment and healing, right? A trauma was typically a wound on the body. That was the way it was understood. However, when Freud speaks about trauma, or when we speak about trauma, we tend not to refer so much to bodily injuries. What we're doing is typically speaking about a psychic injury of some kind. And as I said, this idea of a psychic injury is in some ways new. The idea that we can be psychologically wounded really only began in the late 19th, early 20th century, ironically with the construction of the railroad. Sort of an interesting historical fluke here. What does the construction of the railroad have to do with the emergence of trauma or psychic trauma? Well, once you have the railroad, you have railroad accidents. Trains collide, trains go off the rails. And what people started to see happening, this is very interesting, was that there were individuals who would be in a railroad accident and they would come out of it without any bodily injuries, right? They were like shaken up, but they were, physically they would appear to be okay. But what they would see happen afterwards is that people would suffer from emotional or even psychic symptoms, which is very strange, right? They're not hurt, they don't seem hurt. So what's going on here? If their bodies aren't injured, what's wrong? This problem became even more prominent after World War I because you had, tens of hundreds of thousands of soldiers returning home from the war, a lot of them without physical injuries, but as we know, they saw and experienced horrible, horrific things. And even though they weren't physically wounded, they still appeared to be suffering. Today, we call this PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But a century ago, people weren't quite sure what to do with it. They didn't really understand it. I mean, trauma and PTSD obviously existed before the modern era, but our conception of it as a distinct phenomenon, as I said, is fairly new. So Freud, being the ever-curious detective of human behavior, the human psyche, he's very interested in trauma when he starts seeing it emerge as a larger cultural phenomenon. And he tries to understand it within the context of his own psychoanalytic theory, which even before he writes the Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which is the piece we'll look at, his whole theory is very much rooted in the notion of trauma, or at least the existence of some problematic events, usually in one's childhood, that can serve as a source of psychic pain and dysfunction in the cause of our symptoms that we might be experiencing. So we're going to take a look first, as I said, on a brief citation from Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle. He writes it in 1920. It's one of his later works. Freud dies in 1936 or 37, I forget. And this work is significant because he basically has to rethink a lot of his basic understanding of his metapsychology and his psychoanalytic method. Not so important for our purposes, but I want to just focus on how he thinks about trauma here. So again, he opens by noting that trauma is a relatively new phenomenon, again, tied to the railroads, tied to the war. He says that Here's how he describes it. After severe shock of a mechanical nature, railway collision or other accident in which danger to life is involved, a condition may arise which has long been recognized and to which the name traumatic neurosis is attached. And when he talks about traumatic neurosis, he's basically talking about what we call PTSD. The terrible war that is just over has been responsible for an immense number of such maladies, and at least has put an end to the inclination to explain them on the basis of organic injury to the nervous system due to the operation of mechanical force, right? People come back, they have these symptoms, these psychological issues. We can't explain them in terms of bodily injuries because they just don't have them. And now Freud goes on to describe what are the characteristics of trauma, what makes something traumatic for us. He says, in the traumatic neuroses, there are two outstanding features which might serve as clues for further reflection, right? What makes something traumatic? First, that the chief causal factor seems to lie in the element of surprise in the fright. So what Freud's saying here is that an event is most likely to be traumatic if you don't see it coming, if it's a surprise. Now, why is this? Because the essence of trauma, and this is something much of the scholarship around trauma, I think, agrees on, is that trauma happens to us when we experience something which exceeds our capacity to make sense of it. Trauma is when something happens to us that doesn't make sense, that overwhelms us with profound intensity, and we fundamentally don't know what to do with it. It's a total disruption of our everyday lives. When something is a total surprise to us, it feels like it can't be explained, right? The way we experience the world, the way we normally think about it, is that things are supposed to happen for a reason. Now, I'm not even referring here to religious ideas about hashgacha pratit or divine providence, just that all of us go through our lives, our day-to-day existence with the basic sense that we expect reality to be predictable. So when something is truly a surprise for us, a profound, intense, overwhelming surprise, a radical disruption, a rupture, when it overwhelms us and we don't know how to deal with it, that's what we call trauma. And this point is also emphasized in what Freud says next. He says, and secondly, that an injury or wound sustained at the same time as the traumatic event generally tended to prevent the occurrence of the neurosis. So what Freud is adding here, which is an interesting detail, is that an event is less likely to be traumatic if it leaves some sort of physical mark or wound upon us, upon the body. And the reason for this, presumably, is because if we have a wound, it enables us to grapple more concretely with what has happened to us. What makes psychic trauma so difficult is that there isn't a wound, a physical wound that you can point to, right? There's no easy way to mark what's happened to you when you've experienced trauma if you don't have a physical wound of any kind. There's no way to deal with it directly or to process it, or without a wound, there's no way to make it part of who you are. The characteristic that Freud lays out here regarding trauma, that it marks an event that comes as a total surprise, that overwhelms us with its intensity, that defies explanation, but doesn't necessarily even leave a mark on our bodies. Well, all these details, as you can probably tell, very much describe the last 2 years of coronavirus, right? So it makes sense that this experience that we're going through, that so many of us are struggling with, is something that we would call traumatic, even if we didn't get sick, right? Our total surprise, our world became disrupted, no way to make sense of this. None of us had ever experienced this before, a once in a century pandemic, right? And again, the fact that coronavirus is this amorphous thing, most of us did not get it. You cannot see it, right? Like, how do we even begin to make sense of this? Freud continues in his analysis of trauma, and he makes another very important point about the way trauma stays with us. And this may be the most important thing to keep in mind about trauma. What makes trauma most difficult is the way that it doesn't go away, the way that it persists, that it somehow like stays with you. And whatever you try to do, you just can't shake it. So Freud here, he focuses on dreams, because dreams are very important to Freud and his overall theory. And he notices something about people who experience trauma and their dreams afterwards. He notes that people who experience trauma have dreams about their traumatic experience, dreams that they keep returning to again and again about the traumatic event. Now, today we might call this flashbacks, but it was clear for Freud that whatever there is that's going on about trauma, people keep being drawn back to it over and over again. When you're drawn back to it, again, it's deeply, deeply painful. He says now in the traumatic neuroses, the dream life has this peculiarity. It continues to take this patient back to the situation of his disaster, from which he awakens in renewed terror. What Freud learns from the repeating traumatic dreams is very important, because he calls it a principle for him, what he calls the repetition and compulsion. And what he means by this is that trauma stays with us. It doesn't just fade away. Rather, it's a constant presence in our lives, that the feeling of trauma keeps finding its way to persist, to endure. And despite our wishes to move forward with our lives and to leave it behind us, we keep finding ourselves repeatedly drawn back to it. And the pain that it inflicts upon us, it doesn't take much for us to be thrown back into that situation, which triggers our trauma, and to use contemporary language. And then all of a sudden, we're right back in it again. One final point that Freud makes here that's worth highlighting is the conclusion. He says, but I'm not aware that the patients who suffer from traumatic neuroses are much occupied in the waking life with the recollection of what happened to them. They perhaps strive rather not to think of it. So Freud's argument here also is very, very important. And it's a point he makes throughout his work, right? That when people experience trauma or awake, they try not to think about it. It's in their dreams where it keeps coming back to it, right? Because in truth, we all have a natural tendency to repress trauma, right? This is Freud's basic point from the get-go when he starts to develop psychoanalysis, but we all know this. It's like clear to us. When you experience something traumatic, like you want to do your best to forget about it, to block it away, to pretend like it never happened. Again, however, one of Freud's fundamental lessons, which I think still remains absolutely true, is that when you repress trauma, it always finds a way to come back. And it's when you repress something traumatic, you end up feeling its effects throughout your life, manifesting in all sorts of dysfunction, whether you're aware of it or not. And if I could add just one more characteristic to Freud's definition of trauma here, it's the sense that when trauma happens to us, one's whole world feels like it's overturned, right? The classic line a person might utter to signify an event has been traumatic for them is to basically say, now that X has happened, now that this horrible thing has happened, and it could be, again, a loss of a loved one, an injury, a personal betrayal, whatever it is, whatever we would consider to be something truly traumatic for us, they'll say, now that this has happened, my life will never be the same again, right? Going forward, everything in my life will be marked by that which came before the traumatic event and that which comes afterwards. And we do this not just individually, but culturally. When I think about the truly traumatic events in my lifetime before coronavirus, right, the first one that immediately comes to mind for me was the terrorist attacks of September 11th, right? The hijacking of airplanes by Islamic extremists and driving them into the Twin Towers and other places, killing thousands, was just so unprecedented and so overwhelming. I think I was almost 21 when it happened, that for me and for America, I mean, for lack of a better expression, I remember quite clearly everybody kind of saying afterwards, right, America will never be the same again after this, right? And that's a sign, again, of having gone through a clearly traumatic event. And in the case of September 11th, there's a certain truth to the fact that America hasn't quite been the same afterwards. And I think it's not a stretch to say that a lot of us probably feel that way about coronavirus, that our lives may very well be marked by the split between the time before coronavirus and the time afterwards, which again just goes to how profoundly difficult and overwhelming this is. So to summarize here, just what we can take away from Freud as we go forward and we're thinking about this. Trauma happens when we experience an event that surprises us, that overwhelms us with its intensity, that defies our ability to make meaning of it and to put it into language. And even when the event passes, we still feel the persistence, the presence of trauma in our lives, kind of like a black hole. That's a metaphor I use for myself. It persists, it triggers us and takes us back to the pain and suffering we had experienced as if it's right in the here and now. And when the trauma is intense enough, it serves to rupture our lives. It feels as if we will never be the same again. So I think this captures a lot of sort of how we can think about trauma. The question then becomes, how does this reflect in the Jewish tradition? What is the Jewish tradition? What does Torah have to say about responding or thinking about trauma? So the first thing I'll point out is that oftentimes when trauma is explored from a Jewish perspective, there is a tendency, or what I might even say a temptation, to turn to the Exodus story. So why the Exodus story? Because in a certain sense, it's a great story to use to think about trauma, right? What could be more traumatic than the experience of slavery and all the suffering it imposed on the Jewish people, right? We even have some good descriptions in the Torah, and even more graphic descriptions in the Midrashim about how terrible and overwhelming and traumatic the experience of slavery was. And perhaps even more importantly, why the Exodus is a good story to think about trauma is that the Exodus story has a happy ending. It shows us that trauma can be redeemed, right? The Jews are taken out of Egypt. Their oppressors, the Egyptians, are destroyed. Not only, in fact, are the Jews made free, but they eventually even reach the promised land, right? What could be a better story about trauma than that? We see how terrible it is, how painful it is, how it almost destroyed us, but the story ends in redemption, right? We're taken out and everything is made good in the end. Now, I understand the appeal of this kind of narrative, but I'm not sure it's the best way to think about trauma. And the reason for that is because it has this emphasis of idealizing the notion of redemption, right? That everything can be made right in the end. And in truth, if you look more closely at the Exodus story, you realize it's not so simple. It's not so simple as the Seder where we just say, may have that we went from slavery to freedom, from suffering to joy, from exile to redemption, right? It's a bit more complicated than that. Yes, the Jewish people are freed from Egypt. So you think, they've been able to be freed from their trauma, but as we all know, they don't embrace their freedom. In fact, they all want to go back to Egypt, right? They can't seem to escape their trauma, right? We think about Freud's repetition and compulsion. Well, that kind of describes half of Sefer Shemot and Bamidbar, right? They can't escape the traumas of Egypt, no matter how hard they're trying. And in fact, as we know, the generation of Jewish slaves, they don't actually make it out of the desert, right? They're so traumatized by their experience, you might say, that they can't do it, right? They die in their trauma. They die in unmarked graves in the desert because they can't let go of their trauma. They can't move on. So perhaps if we look more closely at the Exodus story, it's not such an obvious narrative of, oh, wow, you experienced the worst, but don't worry, God can make it better. Everything can be made whole in the end. So the alternative story that I want to look at to think about how the Jewish tradition thinks about trauma, or at least briefly, offers a profound meditation on trauma and how we grapple with it. And you may have already guessed, it's the story of Job, Sefer Iyov. If you're familiar with the book, you'll remember that Job endures almost unimaginable traumas, the kind of traumas that would break any of us. The book opens with Job being told that his 7 sons and 3 daughters were celebrating together when all of a sudden a wind came, causing the house they were in to collapse, killing all of them, right? If you know the book of Job, Job is a successful man, a wealthy man. He's got a big family, big happy family. He's righteous. That's made very clear from the beginning of the book. And basically all of a sudden, what he hears is that his whole family's been wiped out. All his children have been killed. Suddenly it's a surprise. It's overwhelming. It's intense, right? Again, like I can't even imagine, none of us can imagine what that would be like to hear that. And then it gets worse, of course. He's afflicted with a terrible skin disease that causes him pain and discomfort from head to his toe. And as a result of all this, Job is filled with, one might say, depression and anger, right? He's having a normal response that any of us would have to trauma, right? And he's basically sitting shiva for his kids, like in profound pain and suffering, both physically because of his body and the skin disease, and obviously psychically and emotionally from the loss of his loved ones. But in terms of Jewish thinking about trauma, it's what happens next that's so significant, right? Job has 3 friends who come to comfort him, but the way that they comfort him, or the way they try to comfort him, is to tell him that his trauma isn't really trauma, right? So there's 3 friends. Eliphaz is the first one. And what he tells Job is, don't worry about your suffering. Eventually, everything is going to be made right by God. That's the way the world works. The wicked will be punished and the righteous rewarded, right? And that's his response to Job, right? They see Job's trauma and they basically say, don't worry, Job, you can make sense of this. It's not so traumatic. But if trauma is that which eludes our ability to make sense of things, then Job's friends are there to try to help him make sense of it. And they do that, at least initially, by telling Job, don't worry, you think this is crazy. You think this makes no sense. In the end, God's going to work it all out. Don't worry. Of course, Job doesn't want to hear that, right? Job is somebody, to his credit, I think, who doesn't want to let go of his traumas, because at the very least, he doesn't want to hear people who are going to tell him, your trauma wasn't trauma. The next friend comes, Bildad, who tells Job a different answer that he can use to make sense of what's happened to him. He tells Job that his children must have sinned, and that's why they were punished, right? The first friend said, don't worry, everything's going to be okay in the end. And the second friend says, well, wait a second, somebody must have done something wrong. Maybe it wasn't you, Job, but it must have been your children. They deserved it. Of course, again, Job doesn't want to hear this because he knows that's not true. So far as the third friend who comes and tells him, no, in actuality, Job, you're the one who must have sinned. Even though, again, Job doesn't think he's done anything wrong. So how are these attempts to make Job's trauma go away? Well, like I said, it goes back to from the beginning. Trauma is that which overwhelms us, which defies language and our ability to explain what's happened to us. If, in fact, Job's friends can prove to him that there's a reason why these terrible things have happened to him, right, then the presumption is he can let go of his anger and his depression. However, as you all know, Job refuses. He refuses each one of them all the way to God at the very end of the book. And he gets quite angry. He holds on to the fact that an injustice has been done to him. And that's very significant throughout the book. His friends are effectively denying his trauma. And even if he wanted to let it go, it's clear that he just can't, because that's the nature of trauma. When it happens, it rip opens the fabric of your world, revealing a black hole, and there's simply no easy way to repair it. And to me, at least, this represents something deeply authentic about the Jewish response to trauma, even more so than the promise of redemption that we learned from the Exodus story. And why is that? Because it's actually codified by Chazal, by the rabbis in the Talmud, and in Halacha. And when you're a rabbi, you're often put in the position of being one of Job's friends. So I want to just look at briefly how Chazal understand the book of Job and what are some of the lessons that they take away from it here. So they in the Gemara, there's a discussion about ona'at devarim, right, which is a prohibition that you cannot oppress people with words. You can't say things to people that's going to hurt them or insult them. And the Gemara gives examples of this. One of them is that you don't remind somebody who's done tshuva, somebody who used to be a sinner, but now has done tshuva. You don't remind them of their past sins. You don't remind the child of a convert that their parents used to do all sorts of bad things, right? Because saying these things will cause great embarrassment and shame. And then the Gemara continues here, and you see it in the bolded part. It says, if torments are afflicting a person, if a person is experiencing trauma, if illnesses are afflicting them, or if he is burying his children, one may not speak to him in the manner that the friends of Job spoke to him. It's not your fear of God, your confidence in your hope, the integrity of your ways. Remember, I beseech you, whoever perished being innocent. Right? That's a quote from Eov. So again, what the Gemara concludes here is that when someone's experiencing trauma, you are prohibited. You are not allowed to try to give them answers that will help them make sense of it. Because if you do that, you're not being honest to who they are and what they've experienced. Right, like that's a fundamental lesson Judaism is trying to teach us, and it's a very hard prohibition not to transgress. And as I said, I say this as a rabbi who's been in the position of Job's friends more than once in my life. When you're a rabbi and someone comes to you who's experienced or is experiencing real traumatic loss, sudden death of a loved one, a child suffering terribly, a terminal cancer diagnosis. When somebody comes to you with these things, you are desperate to say something to them. You want to say something, offer any kind of religious language that can help them make sense of what they are going through. And this is natural. And it's a sign that you're a human being, that you have empathy for them. But in these moments, one feels the temptation to be like Job's friends, to try to convince the person who's experiencing trauma that everything's going to be all right, or that there is, in fact, some reason that can help make sense of what they're going through. I tend to see myself as a pretty rational person. I think Rav Shmuley can attest to that. I'm not the kind of rabbi who runs to traditional religious explanations for tragedy or suffering, but even so, it's still very easy to fall into the trap of Job's friends, of trying to sort of push the trauma away and try to convince people there's not real trauma there. My very first shiva as a synagogue rabbi really tested me on this. I went to visit a couple. They weren't members of our shul, but they came periodically. And the couple had just lost their son to what was either a drug overdose or suicide. No one knew what was really the story there, and nobody really wanted to talk about it. And I remember sitting with them at their home during Shiva. I literally had just arrived in town a couple of days before, and hearing their profound pain, and these people I didn't even know, but I could just see their hearts were breaking. And all I wanted to do desperately was to offer them some kind of consolation. This issue here, this again, the prohibition of trying to honor trauma, you might call it, is also echoed in another halacha that I think people may be familiar with. When you make a shiva call and you come to comfort a mourner, you do not speak first, right? You walk in, you sit down, you wait for the mourner to speak. And again, this is quite hard if you've ever been in this situation. It makes shiva calls uncomfortable. To have to enter into the home and to sit in the silence. It can kind of be unbearable. But again, it has an important message for us. When there's trauma, you have to honor it. You can't just use superficial words or small talk to distract from it. You have to make a space and just learn how to sit with it in the room. The proof text that the Gemara brings here for this is again from the book of Job. Rabbi Yochanan says here from the source in Moed Katan, the consolers are not permitted to speak words of consolation until the mourner opens and speaks first. And again, here you see it citing from the book of Job. Ironically, in the book of Job, they actually listen to Job's trauma first and talk about it before they answer. Again, they got that part right, but they didn't get the other part right. But for us, again, it remains the same, right? When people are experiencing trauma, it's like prohibited for us to even speak first. We have to learn how to sort of sit with that pain of what they are going through. We don't just get to come and walk in, start with the small talk, try to cheer them up, right? We got to let them feel what they're feeling, and we just got to be there with them. Now, again, I've been talking about the Exodus model here as potentially being problematic, which is sort of strange for a rabbi to do, but I want to give you two practical examples of how we as Jews often run to the Exodus model, and why it's maybe not so good, why it maybe causes us to not deal with trauma, to sort of pretend that we've already solved it, as opposed to dealing with it. And if you think you've already solved it, but you haven't, what you're really doing is engaging in further repression of it, which is potentially very, very problematic. There's a very interesting scholar on this, Dominic LeCapra. I think he was a professor at Ithaca, Syracuse. I can't remember now. Cornell. I think it's Cornell. It's a very, very powerful book called Writing History, Writing Trauma, which he explores trauma from post-structuralism, postmodernism, all history, like a really fascinating perspectives on it. There's an extended interview that he gave with Yad Vashem in the book. And he talks about the problematics of this sort of Exodus narrative of trauma being redeemed. And he cites two examples. The first example is Schindler's List. And I never really thought about this before, but when he describes it, you'll see that there's something very moving and powerful about Schindler's List, but there's something also a little uncomfortable about it when you look closely at what's going on there. He calls Schindler's List a model of the redemptive narrative, right? Where all the trauma basically gets, wiped away. He says it's a very interesting film for the first 3/4 or so, where you have the ambiguities of the Schindler character brought out. He says the first 3/4 of the movie is like good, because it presents things in sort of a multifaceted perspective, right? The fact that he's a Nazi trying to help Jews is retained in its tension. For you have a Nazi who's also an impresario, self-interested, self-indulgent, meaning Schindler's a complicated character. He's a complex character with contradictions, and that's good, right? Because it's showing that that's the way, history, the way human beings really are. But nonetheless, right, he's interested, he's trying to help people, he's taking the risks of it. But he says, it's towards the end of the movie, you have a resolution of all the tensions as Schindler emerges as a martyr and a hero. So Schindler goes from being this complex character who's got all this gray in him, and by the end of the movie, he's like a hero. He's like a tzaddik, right? His associate becomes a sort of Gandhi figure, leading the people across the horizon towards some unimaginable new beginning. You don't know where they're going. You think that they may be going to a land of redemption, right? So the story at the end of Schindler's List, right, is a positive story. It's almost like an uplifting story. I've heard this said before, right? The best Holocaust movie that's ever been made, people would say it's Schindler's List, is a movie about Jews who lived, right? That's a strange movie to choose as embodying the Holocaust, because the story of the Holocaust is not the Jews who lived; it's the Jews who died. And like Capra points out at the end of the movie, he says there's also this final ritual, which is really a kind of redemptive ritual rather than a form of mourning that is tensely bound up with the problems of the past. Instead, you have almost a yellow brick road along which the survivors come and in some sense redeem their past. Or if you're familiar with the end of the movie, I think it's the credits or before the credits, they have survivors saved by Schindler come and you see them now and they're like marching forward, and it's very, very moving. But again, what the Capra's pointing out is that there's sort of a redemptive narrative there that doesn't really describe what the Jewish experience of the Holocaust is all about, right? It's really the opposite of what the Jewish experience of the Holocaust is all about. And that bothers him because you cannot watch that movie and really get a sense of the trauma and the way that the trauma persists and continues for just about everybody. The second example he points to, and I say this as a Zionist and Israeli, is also very, very interesting. What he notes is that Israel had a very hard time with Holocaust survivors in the 50s and even up to the 60s, right? There were hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors who came to Israel after the war, right? Many who fought even in the War of Independence. But Israel did not want to hear from survivors at all. And the reason for this is actually pretty simple, right? The Holocaust traumatized those who experienced it firsthand, and it traumatized all Jews. And basically what Israel felt was, Israel is the recompense for the Holocaust, right? We suffered, we almost just died. Israel is our redemption, right? We overcame unbelievable odds. We miraculously survived. We overcame, right? That is our redemption. And to fit that narrative of Holocaust being almost death and Israel being redemption means that we don't really want to hear from survivors because all they want to talk about is all the horrors and traumas that they experienced. And if Israel is supposed to fix all that, then we don't really want to hear from them, right? And it took years for Holocaust survivors to really open up in Israel because it didn't fit the Zionist narrative, the Jewish narrative. We were slaves in Egypt, but now we are free, right? We almost died in the Holocaust, but now we've been redeemed through the establishment of Israel. And when you repress that kind of trauma for survivors, it was very, very, very painful and difficult for them. And it has ripple effects throughout the entirety of Israeli society. It's much better today, but you can still see some of it, right? There's a discomfort, even in Israel, I think today, with certain aspects of the Holocaust, if those aspects emphasize the trauma of Jewish victimhood, because Israel is so much focused on, again, we are the heroes, we are the masters of our own destiny. And there's a problem, again, when you repress the traumas of the past. I want to transition here, just talk a little bit more about Freud and what it means to think about how we should respond to trauma, right? What should be the way that we deal with trauma in a constructive fashion? I think this is very important for where we are right now. I want to turn to an earlier essay from Freud. It's an essay titled Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through. And for Freud, the way he thinks about dealing with trauma is this expression working through. You have to work through your trauma or the issues that you're suffering from. And it's an idea that's creeped down into our modern usage as well, right? This idea of working through, I think, is one that we are familiar with. And part of the reason I'm so fascinated by Freud here is that when you look at Freud and you look at the way Chazal and the Jewish tradition deals with trauma, you see a lot of very interesting similarities. Right? There's a debate to what extent Freud's Jewishness influences his development of psychoanalysis. I tend to be on the side of those who think that there is a significant connection there. I'll just point out a simple example. Freud's theory of dream interpretation has a lot of similarities with the way Chazal think about interpreting the Torah, right? The symbols of the dreams have all these associative meanings. The words of the Torah have all these interpretive possibilities, right? There's a lot of, I would say, similarities that are there. And I think when we learn about Freud, we can actually learn about Judaism in interesting ways. So when he talks about work key characterly, in this same essay, Freud recounts sort of the history of the development of psychoanalytic technique in the early 1890s. the emphasis was hypnosis. People are suffering because they have some traumatic event or disturbance that they've repressed and is causing all these symptoms, right? We need to hypnotize them so that they can relive the event properly, and then that will help get it out of the unconscious and allow them to let go of it and move on, and their symptoms will disappear. The goal was catharsis. That's what he says. And that was, if you think about it, has a lot of similarities with this Jewish narrative of slavery and redemption, right? You can create this transformative moment that undoes all your pain and your suffering, and you can be reborn, right? Like you can wipe it all away. That was kind of the way they used to think in the early days of psychoanalysis. But Freud notes that over time, they started to realize that approach really didn't make sense, that didn't work a lot of the time. And even if it worked, the symptoms might come back again. And maybe it was only working because of hypnotic suggestion. Maybe it had nothing to do with them actually dealing with any kind of, trauma that they might have repressed. So what Freud develops going forward from that is what we think of psycholytic therapy and all therapy, and that's talk therapy, right? The patient comes in to their analyst and they talk about their problems with the goal of somehow processing it and coming to a greater understanding of it. And even in the relatively early days of psychoanalysis, Freud thought the job of the analyst was to kind of figure out what's wrong with the patient and like tell them. And once the patient hears that, they'll be able to change everything. But Freud also comes to realize that knowledge on its own is not a cure. And what he develops really with psychoanalysis is something of a sort of partnership between the analyst and the patient, in which they have to kind of work together for the patient to come to grips with what's really happened to them. And it's the job of the analyst to be more of a guide than a teacher. As I said, you can't tell somebody who's repressing something what it is and expect that to be solved. Or you can't go to an anti-vaxxer and bring them evidence why they're wrong and expect that to convince them, right? You have to kind of help them figure it out for themselves. And that's a lot of what psychoanalysis is about. That's a lot of what working through is about here. So I won't read this because we don't have time, but I just want to highlight the key details that Freud notes about what does it mean to work through when we're repressing something that's so painful and difficult for us. So the first thing he notes is that the first job is filling in the gaps of memory or repression, and try to give some kind of language for what's happened, right? If trauma is a black hole, right, the first step is trying to name that black hole and try to give some kind of language to understand what's going on there. Number two, right, you got to try to treat the trauma as not something that's just in the past, but as something that exists in the here and now. Right, it's in the room with you when you go into to meet with your analyst. The trauma is not something in your distant memory. It's in the here and now. Internalize it to recognize that it's an enemy worth taking seriously. That's what Freud says here. You got to like name it. It's there. Like you got to think about it and you got to grapple with it because it's a tough enemy. It's a tough one to fight with. Number four, we have to engage our trauma in a therapeutic process, one in which we are allowed to confront our baggage, our symptoms, our pain, and look at it in the eye, as difficult as that might be. Instead of feeling passive, that we're trapped by it, we try to cultivate an active relationship with our trauma and ultimately take responsibility for it, right? The way therapy works is that the kind of relationship you have with your analyst, it's called transference. And without getting into all of it, what it basically means is the relationship that you have with your analyst, they're an important person for you, kind of like a parent, a father, mother, lover. And as we know, with our most intimate relationships, right, you bring all your baggage into it. And the way therapy works is you bring your baggage into the room, your trauma's in it, they're going to come out, right? They're going to repeat themselves. And when they repeat themselves in the context of therapy, of the analytic space, it gives you like a more of a safe space to deal with it and to grapple with and understand it. Because when it happens to you, when you don't expect it, when you're triggered, it just, overwhelms you and practically destroys you. The last point Freud makes is that this idea of working through, it's really hard. It takes a lot of time. There's no shortcuts. And success may not mean that the trauma goes away. There may never be a morning where you just wake up and it's completely gone. But what we can do is change our relationship to trauma. The process of working through allows us to no longer be trapped by it, to keep being triggered in quite the same way. We ultimately learn how to make a space for it, to live with it, to take responsibility for it, to make it a part of our world and to make it part of who we are. For Chazal, the rabbis, the Talmudic rabbis, the Torah really was their medium through which trauma could be worked through. And this makes sense for a bunch of reasons. As I mentioned, in addition to being a problem for the individual, trauma always presents itself as a theological problem, right? Because if God is supposed to make everything okay, like how is it that trauma could be there? And this thing that doesn't ever seem to go away. Chazal themselves experienced the great trauma of the temple's destruction, and the Beit Midrash became a sort of clinical space to engage in Freud's notion of working through, to bring trauma into religious language and try to find a space for it. Right? The Torah and its breadth and depth became a palette through which the rabbis could paint a picture of the world in which God and trauma and the Jewish people could all coexist. Rather than bottling it up, it allowed them to express their anger and their hope, to include a book in the Bible that questions God's justice, right? That's what they did. Like, that's what the book of Job is. A book that actually makes God look pretty bad in the end. If you read to the end of the book of Job, God does not come out looking so great. This is really absurd from a traditional religious perspective, unless you recognize that they did this so as not to repress their own traumas, not to try to wish them away, as Job's friends did. Now, if we had more time, I'd try to show you examples from Chazal where they do this in a variety of ways. There are some very powerful rabbinic stories and midrashim, and they're often quite radical from a theological perspective because they're trying to make a space for God, them, and trauma. But in our remaining time, I want to focus on a more contemporary example because I think it provides a powerful model of what Freud and Chazal saw as the authentic response to trauma, this idea of working through. And what I want to do in just the last 10 minutes or so here is I want to look at an excerpt from an essay by Rav Shagar, Rav Shimon Gershon Rosenberg, an important Israeli religious Zionist thinker. He's born in 1949. He dies in 2007. He's unique for a lot of reasons, and I personally find him very, very, very meaningful, his writings. His teachings engage with continental philosophy, postmodernism, but he's not a philosopher. I think that's important to realize. He's a Rosh Yeshiva. He's a rabbi. And what he tries to do with all the secular thought and all the difficult questions he's raising is try to use these tools as a way of grappling with contemporary religious problems and renewing religious language. Trauma plays a big role in his thought. He was a soldier in the Yom Kippur War. He was part of a tank unit that was sent up to the Golan at the very beginning of the war. I don't know how much people know about the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War stands out as a profoundly traumatic event in the history of Israel because it was a surprise, because the invading armies got so far in before they were driven back. And there were moments there where it wasn't clear whether Israel was going to survive. It was also deeply traumatic for many of the soldiers because there were people on the borders who were completely unprepared. And the soldiers that were called up right away, literally, on Yom Kippur, as Yom Kippur ended, they were sent right to the front where nobody knew what was going on. There was actually a very, very, very powerful Israeli drama series this past year, maybe about a year ago, that reenacted those early days of the Yom Kippur War from the perspective of soldiers on the front lines. It's worth watching. I don't remember I'm going to forget the name at the moment, but it's absolutely worth watching because it captures just how traumatic this experience was. Rav Shagar was one of those soldiers who was called up right away and sent to the front, up to the Golan. He was a tank unit, him and two other soldiers. He was, I think, 23 years old at the time. They arrive at the Battle of Nafach, and their tank is immediately hit. Rav Shagar somehow manages to get himself free of the tank, but his two close friends inside were killed. And Rav Shagar himself was left with very, very serious injuries. It's known that Rav Shagar struggled with PTSD after the war. And it's also clear that he tried to use his Torah as a way of making sense of what he experienced. So he has a very, very powerful essay in his book on the Moadei ER. It's sermons and essays for the month of ER, so essays on Yom HaTzmaut, Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaShoah. And in it, he has this one very powerful reflection on his experiences during the war. It's a longer piece. I'm bringing a section of it here. He describes how, he says here, the final memory he has of being in the tank before it explodes. My last word with Shaya was when we got up close to Nafach. Even then, I didn't absorb the severity of the situation. None of them did. They were kids. They didn't know what they were getting into. But nevertheless, I asked Shaya, because he was the gunner, that if something happened, he should move the cannon so that it is not directly above the driver's compartment, so that in a case of need, I'd be able to get myself free. He promised he would do this, and these were the last words, the last memory I have of him. The next thing I remember, I wake up and I find myself in the driver's compartment full of smoke. It's the fire that woke me up. With the remainder of my strength, I succeeded to free myself with the help of a hammer that I found. I stood several meters beside the tank that was consumed by fire. I saw a giant flame the size of a house with several stories, and was immediately struck by the association of Akedat Yitzchak. Right, this week's Parsha, Akedat Yitzchak is a profoundly traumatic event. It's traumatic for Abraham, it's traumatic for Yitzchak, it's traumatic for Sarah, and it's interesting. That's the immediate association Shigar has, whether he realizes it or not. He knows his friends are dead, right? And that's part of what's overwhelming him in this moment. At the time, I didn't know what had happened to Shai and Shmuel. Had they succeeded in freeing themselves? Perhaps they'd been trapped in the tank. This was my parting picture of those boys. And he goes on to say that after he's freed himself, he's basically in shock. Like he's totally in shock. He's severely injured. He doesn't really know what's going on. He kind of gets off the battlefield, and it's only a couple hours later that he's rescued in a tank by a friend of his, Rabbi Yaakov Meidan, who is today the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion. And then he's basically airlifted to Maimonides Hospital in Haifa. And again, if you read this closely, you'll see that there's all the typical characteristics of trauma. It's overwhelming. He can't make sense of it. There's no words. He loses a sense of time. He doesn't really know what's going on, right? Like, all of these are classically associated with trauma. It's the next part of the drasha, the essay, that's, I think, particularly important for us. And it comes from a reflection that he has nearly a decade later after the events. Rav Shagar gathers with other soldiers who fought in the Yom Kippur War to reflect on what happened to them. And he mentions that some of the soldiers wanted to have a Seudat Hodaya, a meal of celebration. Because according to halacha, if you almost die and you're somehow saved, you need to do something to commemorate this, to express thanks to God publicly. But Rav Shagar explains that he was unable to do this because a Seudat Hodaya would mean denying the trauma he had experienced. And really, it would mean denying the deaths of his close friends. And it was something that was just simply unacceptable to him as a rabbi. He says it as follows: he says, I feel I need to say one more thing. I already said this at the gathering of soldiers on the holiday of Sukkot some years after the war. From a certain perspective, my feeling regarding my survival is different from the feeling of many others that went through the war like me. After the war, people turned to me and said it was incumbent upon me to do a Seudat Hodaya. I've said that I'm not able to do this, not because, God forbid, I reject the good that I experienced. Rather, how can I sing a song to God, citing from Tehillim? I'm not capable of doing this. Am I to have a Seudat Hodaya? What about my friends who did not merit to do so? How could Rav Shagar possibly celebrate when his friends had died so needlessly? To celebrate his survival would be a betrayal of the tragedy and trauma of their deaths. So then how does Rav Shagar understand his traumas from a theological perspective? He acknowledges that trauma always comes with questions that have no answers. And if so, that means we have to think about emunah, about faith, a little differently. He notes that the rabbis compared faith to the shade of the sukkah, right? The whole essay here is about Sukkot, right? Because Sukkot is always wrapped up with the Yom Kippur War, because the war went on through from Yom Kippur into Sukkot. The rabbis talk about faith being the shade of the sukkah. It's an expression that appears in the Zohar. To dwell in the sukkah is to dwell in the shade of faith. However, as we know, a sukkah is not a particularly strong structure. A sukkah is fragile. It's flimsy. It doesn't take much to knock it over, and it can't even protect you against the rain. And what Shagar notes is the same is true with emunah, with faith. And he says, on that same Sukkot, I also said, and the words are connected to the matters of the day, that the sukkah, which symbolizes our trust in God, does not protect us in this world. The sukkah is an expression of reality that is found in the shade of faith, but nevertheless, still shade. We often think about faith, emunah, as being symbolized by the metaphor of light. That's the metaphor that's classically used most commonly in Tanakh, right? Light brings clarity, warmth, right? These are the things that we associate with faith, what faith is supposed to grant us. But the rabbis don't only compare faith to light; they also compare it to shade here, which is very significant for Rav Shigar. He says, "We dwell in the shade of the sukkah and not its light. A person thinks that the sukkah, which is called faith and trust in God, protects them on a physical level. However, a person will see with their eyes that a sukkah does not protect us in the reality of our lives. In the reality that appears before us. The divine providence we all believe in exists in the world like shade and not like light. Therefore, from this perspective, the relationship to war is not just relationship to pain, rather it is also relationship to hester panim, the hiding of God's face, of questions, of shade, the shade of faith." He goes on to say, I admit and confess, I assume there's people out there greater than me that are not stuck in the shade and with questions, right? They don't have trauma. There are people who went to the Yom Kippur War that don't have trauma. But faith in my eyes cannot be derived from the repression and the removal of questions. The religious Zionist community in general, you should know, tended to repress the traumas of the Yom Kippur War, because for them, the story of Israel was the story of redemption, right? We are moving towards Geula, Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu, right? And then you have the Yom Kippur War come, which is so traumatic, they almost die, right? Religious Zionism doesn't have the tools to make sense of it, so they tended to repress it. Rav Shigar was saying, no, we can't do that. We just can't. He goes on to cite a famous midrash based on Shir HaShirim, where where the midrash says faith is like dwelling in the shade of the apple tree. Everybody flees from the apple tree in the heat. Why is this? Because it doesn't really provide much shade. So too, the same is for us. So too, God sometimes has an inverse relationship to the world. Faith is found specifically in the questions that, as Rabbi Nachman of Breslov taught, have no answers. So what you see Rav Shigar doing here, I think it's a very important model for us, is that he's trying to make a space for his trauma within religious language. He's trying to bring his trauma into in Freud's term, into the clinic, and with the analyst, Rav Shigar is bringing it into the Beit Midrash. He's trying to find a way to bring it into religious language, because trauma means there's no story of faith where you can tell where everything is going to be okay. He's trying to use Torah to give it a space, to make it real, but in doing so, and I think this is very important, Rav Shigar is also able to ensure that it doesn't forever paralyze him. It's not just enough to say, don't repress trauma, right? That talk about it. Because the thing is with trauma, if all you do is talk about it, you never let it go. In fact, talking about it can actually make it worse, right? The challenge is to talk about it, to bring it out and find a way to change your relationship to it, to make sure that it doesn't become this eternally destructive force in your life and traps you and that you can't escape from it. And as we said, this is not easy work. It's really a life's work. Rav Shigar struggles with his experience during the war for decades. And in many ways, it's the impetus for his whole life's work, his whole project with Torah. What he wants to do is he wants to renew religious language, the language of Torah, and to make a space for it for all Jews, regardless of their experiences. And in a lot of ways, I think this is the task for us all now in the wake of coronavirus. And I think Rav Shigar, and going back to Freud and Chazal, they present the model here for us, right? First, to name that trauma is real. Many, if not all of us, have experienced one form or another these last 2 years. We have to be able to not repress it. We have to say we've gone through something traumatic. We have to be able to name it. That's the first point. The second point is that we have to work to give people space to voice their traumas, to be able to talk about it, to give language to it. But as I said, that in itself is not enough, right? And the third point is that we have to help people in the process of working through their trauma, not to be seduced by easy solutions, but rather to help people externalize their experiences, to recognize that they need to do this so that they don't devour them, and to ultimately take responsibility for their traumas, to recognize that they're there and they are terrible, but we can change our relationship to it. We can learn how to make them a part of us if we're really willing to grapple with them, as Job did, as Chazal did, and as Rav Shigar did here too. For me, at least as a rabbi, Torah is essential for this. When it felt for me that the world was collapsing around me, especially during the beginning of the pandemic, I kept finding myself turning to Torah as a lifeline and a way to make sense of my new reality. That's the way Torah is for me, and I'm sure that is the way it is for a lot of us here. Part of the reason Torah is so powerful this way as in a therapeutic sense is because Torah is like the analyst.